in the Northern Territory will be critical for us to understand, because unless we understand how racism operates in Australia and how Albanese's Labor government will always fail Aboriginal people, we won't be able to fight back against the oppression Indigenous people face, let alone win land rights and self-determination. And unless we fight for Indigenous rights and against racism, we will never be able to overthrow the system of capitalism that oppresses all working class people. So the first thing that I wanted to talk about was the Northern Territory intervention, which was started by former Liberal Prime Minister John Howard in 2007. It's useful to start by explaining where the ceasefire title for this talk comes from. The demand for a ceasefire for the police to be disarmed in Aboriginal communities in the Northern Territory comes from the Walpuri community in Yendamu after the police murder of Kumanjai Walker in November 2019. Kumanjai Walker was a 19-year-old Aboriginal man who was killed in his grandmother's home while on sorry business by racist cop Zachary Rolfe. The Walpuri community pinpoints the intervention as a crucial factor that enabled Rolfe to kill Kumanjai and blamed the intervention policies for the chokehold that the Northern Territory and federal governments have on Aboriginal life. The intervention policies aim to be a final dispossession by taking full control of Aboriginal townships. The intervention policies tried to sweep away the so-called Aboriginal problem and tried to bury the idea of Aboriginal self-determination. It was an attempt to assimilate Aboriginal people into mainstream Australia through a raft of punitive, racist and paternalistic policies. The intervention is a continuation of the racism that the Australian state is built on. The Racial Discrimination Act had to be suspended for the intervention to take place because it was specifically targeted against Aboriginal communities. The intervention had support from Labor from the start, and Kevin Rudd, who won the election in November 2007, continued the intervention policies when he came to power. So some of the first policies of the intervention were for the government to control up to 50% of welfare payments of Aboriginal people, forcing them onto a basics cards that they could only use at select stores like Woolworths. A blanket ban on alcohol consumption was enforced for Aboriginal communities. This gave the police the pretext to harass and raid Aboriginal communities and houses without warrants. Control of Aboriginal townships and community assets like community buildings and road machineries were seized by the government, which destroyed any semblance of self-determination in an instant. One of the biggest impacts was the taking away of thousands of Aboriginal jobs on the CDEP scheme, the Community Development Employment Programs, and forcing Aboriginal people to be on work for the dole programs instead, which were for much less money. And the services that the CDEP was providing for Aboriginal communities were cut as well. The intervention was justified on the basis that Aboriginal communities were dysfunctional, rife with abuse, particularly child sexual abuse and pedophile rings, and only extreme government intervention could improve Aboriginal people's lives. The claims that in Aboriginal communities there was a pedophile ring in every one of them have never been proven because it's false. But the damage was done to Aboriginal communities, particularly Aboriginal men, to paint them as unsafe for children and unable to help themselves. The legacy of the intervention hangs like a nightmare over Aboriginal communities in the Northern Territory and has contributed to racist ideas being further inculcated into the police force. Incarceration rates skyrocketed during the intervention, while health, education and poverty outcomes for Indigenous people either stayed the same or got worse. Damningly, there was a 500% increase in attempted suicides and self-harm in remote communities in the years immediately after the intervention. And the racist Country Liberal Party, the CLP government in the Northern Territory, is turbocharging the offensive against Aboriginal people, as Mililma will describe. So the racist policies of the intervention have increased social misery in Aboriginal communities, and those policies have been enforced by the police. The Australian government, whether Labor or Liberal, have a policy to assimilate Aboriginal people into mainstream Australia. The government wants to make conflicts over land a thing of the past, as well as conflicts over Indigenous people practicing their culture instead of participating fully in mainstream Australia. The cops are there to enforce this policy of assimilation. Part of the rationale for the intervention was to force Aboriginal people in so-called economically unviable remote communities to move to 20 regional town hubs where they could participate in the economy more and give up their land and culture while doing so. In the years after the intervention, and still today, the government has refused to build more homes in chronically overcrowded Aboriginal communities, which is part of the attempt to force those communities into the regional hubs. The effects of overcrowded housing mean that Aboriginal people live in third world conditions where diseases like trachoma and endemic hearing loss are rife. The loss of hearing results in difficulties learning and participating in society, meaning more unemployment and often leading to people to turn to alcohol to numb the pain. Drinking in public means the police are more likely to pick up Aboriginal people and put them in custody, which results in the increased likelihood of dying in custody. And the negative health and education effects of living in overcrowded housing gives the state the pretext to take Aboriginal children away from their families. Aboriginal mothers and parents are accused of being neglectful because they are structurally unable to provide for their children. And it is the police who are involved in taking the children away from Aboriginal families by force if necessary, which is exactly what they did during the stolen generations. Government policies also exacerbate the cost of living stress, which disproportionately affects Indigenous people. The government hasn't introduced any serious rent caps, meaningful energy subsidies, has kept wages down and Centrelink payments down, and the government has provided no funding for community services or job training. So Aboriginal people are disproportionately turning to crime to try and meet their basic needs. The police are then there to lock them up and blame the victim for the misery that's enforced on them by the system. What we need to understand about the police is that, as well as being the arm wing of the state that enforces racist policies, their central role is to defend a deeply unjust social order, protecting property and wealth in a capitalist system based on extreme inequality. In Australia, the police were first created to discipline convicts and other lower classes. They also helped carry out the massacres of Aboriginal people, driving them off the land to make way for pastoral capitalism. Police have been central to upholding Aboriginal oppression ever since, enforcing racist protection laws, confining people onto reserves and forcibly removing children. Today, the police justify the role they play in enforcing the shocking poverty and violent social conditions many communities live with by using racist ideas that essentially consider Aboriginal people to be subhuman. And evidence shows that the police are seriously an unreformable racist institution. There was a coronial inquest into the police murder of Kumanjai Walker that found the Northern Territory Police Force is systematically racist. The report was released just after Kumanjai White, another young Warlpiri man, was killed by an off-duty police officer in Alice Springs Coles last year. Rolf, the cop who killed Kumanjai Walker in 2019, bragged about being able to do cowboy shit with no rules and toweling, as in bashing, local Aboriginal people. He was a vile racist, but he was acquitted by an all-white jury of murder in 2022. The acquittal just emboldens Northern Territory Police to continue to be racist and target Aboriginal people. The tragic consequences were seen with the murder of Kumanjai White last year. We do support the demand of Indigenous people for killer cops to be locked up, for the police to be disarmed, and for funding for police to instead go towards Aboriginal controlled programs. We also support calls for the police to be abolished, but unfortunately the police can only be abolished in the context where there's actually a working class revolution that takes on the power of the state and, defeats its police force and its army. But in the interim between now and revolution, we have to understand how Labor has paved the way for racist ideas and racist parties like One Nation to thrive. And we have to put demands on Labor to lock up the racist cops that are killing Aboriginal people on their watch. Since the failure of the Voice to Parliament referendum in October 2023, Albanese and Labor governments around the country have completely dropped any talk or actions to improve the lives of Aboriginal people. Albanese promised that the Voice to Parliament would change things for the better, but before and especially after the failure of the Voice, Albanese has done nothing to reverse the policies of the intervention. He's refused to fund housing in overcrowded communities, and he's refused to fund Aboriginal-controlled health, education and employment programs. Not to mention that Albanese has greenlit every major fossil fuel project on Indigenous land from coast to coast. Yeah. The referendum came back with a 60% no vote, and Albanese decided that it was not electorally popular to speak about Indigenous rights, and he's chosen not to lift a finger since. He's overseen the skyrocketing rates of Indigenous incarceration and black deaths in custody. There's been over 600 deaths in custody since the Landmark Royal Commission in 1991, and the rates of death in custody is actually increasing because the rates of incarceration themselves are increasing under Albanese's watch. Indigenous people in Australia continue to be the most incarcerated people on the planet. The incarceration rate jumped by 10% between 2024 and 2025. And the government's own Closing the Gap report from this year shows that they are still failing Aboriginal people. Of the 19 closing the gap targets, only 4 of those targets were on track, 11 were improving but not on track, as in those targets were not being met, and 4 of those targets were actually getting worse. It's illuminating that the 4 targets that were getting worse were adult Indigenous incarceration, the highest it's ever been. Children starting school are not developmentally on track to meet education targets. More children are being taken away from their families and put in out-of-home care, which is a repeat of the stolen generations. And rates of suicide in Indigenous communities are increasing. So very clearly, the oppression of Indigenous people is getting worse in this country. But despite all of these horrors, I do think that there's reason to hope. The size of the Invasion Day rallies this year shows that there's a clear, strong sentiment of support for Indigenous rights. Tens of thousands turned out in capital cities like Sydney and Melbourne, and many thousands more joined protests around the country. But to fight for Indigenous liberation and to lock up killer cops, we're going to need to see mass protests and workers' strike action to force Albanese's hand. There is a strong history of union action for Indigenous rights. The historic Gurindji walk-off in the 1960s was supported by the trade union movement around the country, collecting money for the strike fund and joining protests in support of land rights. The Black Moratorium marches in the 1970s had significant trade union contingents, with many stopping work to join the weekday demonstrations in major cities. This period was when serious wins like the Aboriginal legal and health services were established. And there are glimmers of this history today. In New South Wales, there's a significant union endorsement of the Gomeroi demands to get Santos's Pilliga gas project off their country. Union New South Wales is putting the support behind the campaign. During the initial years of the intervention, the CFMEU, the construction union that's now been put into administration by Albanese, the CFMEU actually voted to support the repealing of the intervention legislation in 2008. Not long after, in 2009, the ACTU, the peak body of trade unions in Australia, called for an end to the racially discriminatory policies that targeted Aboriginal people in the Northern Territory. Many unionists today attend the Invasion Day marches, and on January 26th, there was a lot of outrage at the police violence against Indigenous people. To build on this support, we need to continue to support Indigenous-led campaigns and demands like no military homes on Aboriginal land on Lee Point in the Northern Territory, repeal all the intervention-era policies, no gas on Gomeroi land or anywhere else, and no money for new prisons, fund Aboriginal communities instead. We have to demand that killer cops get locked up and fight against the systemic oppression Indigenous people face. And we have to keep fighting until we smash this racist capitalist system and win real liberation. Every working class person in Australia, Indigenous or not, has an interest in supporting Indigenous demands for land rights, the disarming and defunding of the police, and fighting for Aboriginal communities. The same government and police force that oppress us when we protest for Palestine or take strike action at work are the same government and police force that oppress Aboriginal people. Only by uniting the struggles against the system can we win Indigenous liberation, and only by fighting against racism and uniting the working class will we be able to get rid of this racist capitalist system for good.
So much, Luke, for that, and you set a really good foundation of kind of the historical layout and the political layout of the NT. So I thought I would add some colour and fill in some of the details of what it's like to live in the apartheid state of the NT and what it's like to live in the police and militarised occupation that is Northern Territory. I am a Dangglaba Kulumbringin Tiwi woman, and my grandfather is from a place called Nardidi, which is just outside of Wadair, Port Keats. And I have my family here that I won't point to because I'll get shame, but love them so much. And these are very real stories that have real impacts on our family. And so I'm trying not to trauma porn it of like what I'm going to talk about, and trying to come at it from a strengths place and from our resistance and continued fight. I am a visitor to this country. This is ground zero. This is the place where we first heard about sexism and racism, homophobia, everything. It was introduced to us, all of those vile things. And I really think about the old people of this country as being the the people who protected the rest of us blackfellas that allowed us to still be here today, is because of the old people from this country. And so I always feel really indebted to these old fellas here, and feel very grateful for them and their fight, because without them and the fight that they led and the wars that they fought and the outposts that they burnt down with their own fire, we wouldn't be here today. So shout out to the Gadigal and the Bidjigal and the Darawal, because we wouldn't be here without you, mob. And we all know that back home, like they are everything to us. So we have to really understand that context. And now the NT, I would say, is the new frontier, with everything that we're experiencing. But the difference is that we have the intellect and knowledge from our countrymen down here that's been shared with us. So we actually have more skills to build on. I wrote a few things down that Luke had mentioned that I thought I would explain some stories around. So they included the Rolfe trial, the acquittal of his murder, stolen kids, the police massacres upholding racism, and how the Labor government has paved the way for everything that we're seeing today. And so I thought I would give some stories around that. So first of all, the Walker and Rolfe trial, I was privileged and honoured enough to spend time with the families during that murder trial in Darwin. It happened on our country, on Gulumedigan, and the Walpuri mob and the families actually came to our families, to my uncle Tibby and to others, to ask for permission for them to come to our country to have that trial. So we had our own system there of governance and understanding that happened whilst the whitefellow system was happening. And I got to mainly look after the kids to keep them out of that courthouse, the Supreme Court in the NT. But just the organisation within the communities led by all of the elders from Yuendamu was really powerful and strong, but also very loving and very caring. And you might all know Ned, but there are so many other old fellas that led in that movement of bringing the families together and sitting in that courthouse. And that trial went on for like 2 weeks or something. It was like every day going into that courthouse, seeing Zachary Rolfe. He actually, because it was during COVID times, they had to like separate all the jury out. So the jury actually was spread in all of the stands, and Zachary Rolfe actually sat with his family in the main audience of the courthouse. Now, in law school, we learn about like all of the symbolism and ceremony around the courthouse and how it's laid out. And so for the jury, they actually were sat here looking back at Zachary Rolfe, who was sat here with his mum by his side. So what that does psychologically to the jury is sees like this innocent man with his loving family. And I just wonder the positioning of that, how he was afforded that when so many other black fellas who do way less than what he did are sat in the cage over here. But Zachary Rolfe was sat there with his mum right by his side, holding his hand, wearing her pearls. It was a whole thing. And so just that is kind of the image I wanted to let you know of what was happening during that trial, on like just like the room, setting the scene. Zachary Rolfe is sitting there plain clothed, not in any kind of court uniform or jail uniform. Like he looked very innocent the entire time. And then they actually, on the last day when the verdict got handed down, there were so many people in the courthouse that they opened up the other courthouses like the other rooms in the courthouse, and all of the men went into the one where Zachary Rolfe was, but all of the women and children went into the court next door. And that's where I was sat in there, and we viewed the handing down through a TV screen. And he was tried for 3 different things: harm causing death, manslaughter, and murder. And they read it out from order of like murder first, and then manslaughter, and then the last one, and just like not guilty, not guilty, not guilty. And people started crying in the courtroom and got in trouble by the court staff for being too loud. That was his mums and his nanas in the courthouse crying. And so we actually had to be ushered out of the courthouse for being too loud in response to, like, this outcome. So just this constant policing of our behaviour, of how we're meant to respond to a horrific thing that's happened. And then we all moved from the courthouse over. There's a park opposite the courthouse called the Rain Tree Park in Darwin, where, like, there's some lovely rain trees there. And so we went and sat under there. And that's when we found out that a young boy had been shot 6 times by police in the back in Palmerston that same day. And that young boy was 19 as well. And he had been walking home from a spear building workshop, and he was carrying a spear that he had made, that he was very proud to have made, and the police thought that he was a threat and shot him 6 times in the back. He managed to miraculously survive that, this young fella, and we went and visited him in hospital. He's now got a whole heap of, like, physical complications because they shot in his spine. So he now, I think he has movement in his legs, but he's in a wheelchair, and he's also now self-medicating and gone down quite a dark path. But this was a very, like, talented young fella who I think just responded in the way that he needed to. But in being shot in the back on the same day that Rolf was acquitted, justified to me what Luke mentioned about the emboldening of the police force with the handing down of that. Like, that, I think that was definitely a flex. They knew that they could get away with shooting this other 19-year-old black boy in Palmerston. And yeah, there's that young fella actually then got charged with assault police or something like that. But the officers who did that to them have walked away with nothing, and that young boy actually had to go to court and face his charges for what he did, which was holding a spear that he had made. Anyways, so that's, just painting this picture of, like, this constant police-state interactions and how emboldened they are. And the response then as well, just offering no support for that young fella and then his family. And he lived in a housing commission house and wasn't able to use, like, they didn't have an accessible bathroom for him. So it made it very hard, and the family couldn't afford to make any changes. And NT Housing wasn't about to do anything about that. And so the family were just forced to try and figure out how they were going to support their son and brother now live with these complications and harm caused by the cops. This also then, when I was doing some research into just how big the police presence is in the NT, I was reminded of these characters that I call Smurfs in Darwin, which are these blue shirt officers or security people that drive around in golf buggies and patrol Darwin suburbs and streets. And these same officers, security officers, I began to recognise when I was working in Dondale that they were the same people that were guards in Dondale who were also these security people. And they work for a private security company, and there are many of them around the NT, that make up what I've now discovered is this huge police state of a combination of officers that are paid for and employed by the NT police, but also are made up of private security guards, PPSO, which is the public safety officers, which have just been created to patrol and arm buses and shopping centres in Darwin. And they are a new, like, quasi-police body. And then there's also the TSD, which is a paramilitary body. So when I did my research into how many police officers there are in the Northern Territory and which state and jurisdiction has the most police officers, the Northern Territory ranks highest by far, with about 505 police officers per 100,000 people. The next jurisdiction is New South Wales, with about 250 cops per 100,000 people. The NT's population is under 300,000 people in its totality, and 30% of that population are blackfellas. And this number of police doesn't even include the private security detail, the PPSO officers, and the paramilitary. Like, those numbers are not even included in that. Then I decided to delve in deeper, and I'm walking, going, hold on, what else is reminiscent of the police state when I'm walking through the streets of my hometown? Oh, that's right, all the CCTV cameras everywhere. I wonder how many of those we have. And I found that the Darwin City Council has put in 138 CCTV cameras that all have facial recognition technology, that the territory, state and federal governments are allowed to request them to turn on at any time, and that they do not have to tell the people about. And then I tried to ask and look into how many police cameras there are, and there is no public number of police CCTV cameras. So we know at a minimum that there's like 505 cops per 100,000 people. We know at a minimum there's 138 cameras through the Darwin CBD. And then I remembered that we have police drones. And so started to look into those in Alice Springs. And this is where it gets to the Labor Party's complete enabling of the police state. And I found some interesting information, which was that in December 2024, after the Country Liberal Party had been elected by a landslide, Leah Finocchiaro, my favourite person in the entire world, the Chief Minister of the Northern Territory, she wrote to, apparently on the 13th of December, wrote to Malarndirri McCarthy and Marion Scrimgeour and asked for 7 key reforms as part of the new Northern Territory government that they needed the Commonwealth government to support them on and enable. I'm going to read them to you. The first one is that Centrelink payments they want to change the payments to be made only on alcohol-free days in Aboriginal communities. They want to reinstate working for the dole with fortnightly, what's it called? You have to sign in. Thank you. And they want to audit performance review of federally funded programs. They wanted, number 4, to ensure royalties were handed out in communities and not in Alice Springs. They wanted to, 5, extend the Civil Aviation Safety Authority to exempt Alice Springs from aviation policies to allow for police drones. They wanted to, number 6, implement additional income management for parents of youth offenders. And 7, enable referrals of negligent parents to additional income management. Out of all of those 7, Malarndirri, Marion, and Albanese, the Labor government, ignored every one of them except for number 5, which was to exempt Alice Springs from adhering to the CASA civil aviation legislation to allow for police drones that have ended up surveilling Alice Springs 24/7. And they actually have not publicly announced the limitations of these drones and what their capabilities are. So we do not know whether the drones have facial recognition or thermal imaging, whether they're integrated with the CitySafe CCTV program, which is the police CCTV stuff, how long the footage is stored, and whether the footage is shared with other agencies. But we can assume that all of those things are happening. And this was approved and enabled by some blackfellas in the Labor government and like the entirety of the Labor government. And so I just wanted to paint those pictures, pretty down and depressing, and I've got like 2 minutes left. But I wanted to summarize that by saying this is the reality of being a blackfella in the NT, just with like some of those very minor examples that I've spoken about. But despite all of that, I wanted to speak to our mobilisation post the referendum has been really profound. So, like, in response to the deaths in custody, also there were 2 more deaths in custody in the last 2 weeks. 20-something-year-old men have been killed by police again. I don't know why they always happen in 2s. There's this weird thing. I don't know. I was thinking about that last night. But in response to that, there has been a movement on the ground. My brother boy, Gadrian from Borroloola, Uncle Ned from Yuendamu, Auntie Natalie Hunt, who's based in Darwin, but she's Nugana from WA, Thomas Mayo, and a few others. Regardless of our stance on the referendum with whether we wanted to vote no or yes, we decided to put all of that aside and come together in response to the rising fascism and apartheid state of the NT, and have been organising for some big mass mobilisations. And this work has been happening all throughout last year and got put on hold because of the cyclone. Shout out to Santos and Impex for that one. But there is a movement building and there's a deep solidarity happening between blackfellas regardless of what had happened in the referendum, and also in response to mass forced migration that's happening as a result of the climate collapse, which a lot of our families in Nayu and like Daly River and across the whole top end are facing, which has all been very policed, by the way. Something you should all look into is like the movement of people from Nayu and Daly River and across the NT in response to Cyclone Narelle, because all of our families are being shipped into like showgrounds and big compounds that are all policed. Everyone's wearing wristbands that they're not allowed to leave in or out the facility without signing in or out. People aren't allowed to just have family come and visit them. Everything has to be signed in or out. No, it's not a public, like, free-moving space. People are also not able to shower without having a security member or police officer with them. These are people escaping the climate crisis in their communities. All their communities are flooded and have been shipped into Darwin since January. So there are people that have been moved off their country into Darwin right now and are still there in completely insecure housing, and that are being policed. So all of this is being managed by the police state, which is something that we need to mobilise on, and might be something that brings us back together in terms of the movement that we were trying to do at the end of last year. This is like a real turning point in mobilisation. So there's something in the absolute intersection of the climate collapse as well as the police state, all kind of compounding and making it really awful to be black in the NT. So that's what's happening right now. There is a lot of work to be done in terms of amplifying these stories and raising awareness of why the police are the ones responding to the climate collapse. Shouldn't that fall into another domain? And speaking to, like, we're now refugees. We actually have like refugee status in our own country, and being treated in concentration camps and open air prisons and compounds. So things are only getting worse. There's not really many happy, fun things to say other than stay learned, my friends. And yeah, we're going to organise against it. But thank you so much.